Good afternoon, all. My name is Sophie Hooper, Head of Policy and Research at IWFM, and I will be your host for today's webinar, which is brought to you in collaboration with ARC Workplace Risk. Once again, I've got a fantastic panel with me, and I'll let them introduce themselves shortly. Today's topic is about structural safety, and we all know that within building safety, structural safety has long been playing second fiddle to fire safety. Once the structure has been completed, it so very often has been hidden away, and those managing buildings, you, often don't know or understand what they have been inherited. Legislation over the last few years has been trying to provide a bit more clarity about what is part of the structure and its obligations. And for certain buildings, there is a greater drive to comply with increasing requirements. But are those obligations really new? In any case, much less is known about how to manage structural components and their risk than there is about fire. FMs obviously play an important role in maintaining the structural integrity of the buildings you manage, irrespective of the building type or the function throughout its life cycle. This webinar gives us an opportunity to discuss what delivering best practice structural risk management entails and how FMs play an important role in occupied buildings. And after a short presentation by David, who will outline key principles, the panel will discuss practical insights on how to optimize structural risk management. The slides will be available after the session on our website, and you will also get the link to the webinar so you can share with colleagues or watch again. We encourage you to ask questions throughout. We will pick these up and discuss them after the presentation. Can we please ask you to put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat function? And like all platforms, you can ask these questions anonymously if you would prefer that. David and Wayne. David, can I please ask you to briefly introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Sophie. My name is David Hills. I'm Senior Director at ARC Workplace Risk, responsible for technology, but also compliance as well. I'm actually an ex-building control officer, responsible for some very large construction sites. And I currently now work with thousands of our clients, trying to support them through, as Sophie was saying, the new regime in respect of building safety. And I'm qualified in both chartered surveyor and also a fire engineer as well.
Thank you, David. Wayne.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Wayne Ward. I am currently an associate director with Faithful and Gould. However, my background is as a trained building surveyor, and I was heavily involved in the stock transfer market, mostly on the structural side with non-traditional buildings and large panel system building investigations at that time. But I've got a very broad range of experience in construction client side, understanding on the refurbishment or large scale refurbishment of portfolio buildings. I've personally led the refurbishment of 17, 18 story plus blocks. I've probably refurbished 6,000 or 7,000 non-trads to a licensed standard over my lifetime. So understand a lot of what information is there, what information isn't there, and I think that's the input I'll be bringing to this webinar.
Well, thank you, Wayne, and I'm really pleased that we've got such broad experience here today from all across different building types available. David, can I please invite you to do your presentation, and if I could please remind the audience, ask away on the questions in the Q&A session as soon as the questions come up. Thank
Fantastic. You. Thank you very much. If I could have my first slide then. So thank you very much. I'm going to be focusing very much on building structural risk management. If I can have the next slide, I'll jump over that one as well. A little bit about myself, as I said, I've been heavily involved in the industry, but if we can move on to the agenda. Okay, so I'm going to be covering today just a quick introduction to risk management and really focusing on perhaps three notable structural failures that have had or will have a big impact on structural risk management. I'm going to talk about structural risk management itself, about how and how it affects certain elements. I'm going to talk about structural risk management in today's world and the guidance that's out there. and then very specifically focus on the Building Safety Act and taking on from that, looking at structural risk management and a safety management system. If I can have the next slide, please. So just want to focus very much on these three particular notable failures. I want to start obviously with 1968 and Ronan Point. What we had at Ronan Point in London was a 22-story residential block that had been open for a couple of months. And we had a small gas explosion that effectively took out one of the load-bearing walls. That load-bearing wall failure actually led to a disproportionate collapse of a corner of that particular building, caused basically by poor design and very poor construction. And that actually led not only to the death of 4 people, but actually it led to some significant changes in building regulations within the UK and the introduction of the requirements currently certainly in the English building regulations of Part A in respect of disproportionate collapse. The other one I wanted to talk about is actually Surfside Condo in Orlando, because that again is a very interesting failure. We had a 12-story block which actually very early in one morning partially collapsed. It partially collapsed because of long-term degradation of what appears to be the concrete frame and specifically the reinforcement. Now, interestingly, competent persons had actually undertaken surveys of that particular building, and over the 5 years prior to the collapse had actually highlighted particular concerns relating to the actual reinforcement itself. That particular failure actually led to 98 people being killed, quite a significant failure. Now, those other two buildings were obviously residential and were occupied buildings. The final one I wanted to talk about, just purely because it's still in most of our minds, is the Didcot Power Station collapse. Now, this came about during preparations to actually demolish the whole of that particular building. We still don't know what the actual failures were or the actual causes of that failure. We are still waiting 8 years or 7 years later for the investigation report to come out. But that actually led to 4 deaths. So these are just 3 of probably around about 1,000 that I was able to find, certainly since 1900, of the types of failures that have actually been occurring in respect of structural buildings. I have excluded specifically here Grenfell, because Grenfell clearly wasn't a structural failure, but we do obviously that has had a major impact. Can we have the next slide, please? So what is structural risk management? Structural risk management actually does depend upon where you are in that building's life cycle. For example, structural risk management in the design process is completely different to during the service life of that building, the in-use area. During the design process, you will have structural engineers undertake a technical design and development for that particular building. During the construction process, structural engineers will continue to be involved and deal with change management. Now, obviously, during the life cycle of that building in its in-use phase, you're going to need to actually undertake ongoing assessment and inspection of that building, depending upon the design, depending upon the arrangements. And then ongoing from that, during any refurbishment, you would normally have a structural engineering technical design again with ongoing management, and then again through development and into demolition, you will see that actually you'll need again further technical support, excuse me, and ongoing management. Next slide, please. So I'm going to focus, as I said, about or in the in-use buildings area. And so for in-use buildings, structural risk management is actually a very simple process. It's a process of measurement and analysis of the performance of that building's structure. And what we're looking to do, what we're looking to achieve through that process is 3 things. We want to determine the overall continued structural stability of that building, making sure that it's going to stay there and it's going to continue to perform as designed. We want to also identify any potential causes of any damage and to actually understand any potential risks for further damage. So structural risk management is about measurement and analysis of the performance of that building. Next slide, please. Now, the benefits for structural risk management are actually relatively simple and pretty easy to understand. It's going to provide you with very good early warning of any particular structural weakness within your particular building, be it residential, be it commercial, retail, it doesn't really matter. We need to understand what those potential structural weaknesses are and determine if we have any damage within that building. Now, this is going to be crucial for different reasons. Clearly, under the Building Safety Act, which focuses very much on residential blocks, it's going to be crucial to actually ensure the occupants' safety, the safety of the particular residents within that building. But going on from that, it's also going to be crucial for insurance purposes, ensuring that you're actually getting the best out of your insurance premiums, getting the most favorable rates. For actually avoiding litigation, you certainly don't want to get involved with litigation, and making sure that you actually understand how that building is operated, designed, and very much how that structure is working is important to understand, and also to actually therefore further prevent damage to that building, and of course day-to-day asset management. Next slide, please. So how does structural risk management manifest itself currently in today's world? Well, in the main, we have a series of guidance and a series of processes and procedures that we need to follow in order to actually achieve good structural risk management. First things first, during design, construction, and of course refurbishment, we've got a whole series of building regulations, be it in England and Wales, Scotland, as well as Northern Ireland, of course. And of course, we've got guidance there in respect of how the buildings should be built, sizes of structures, design of structures. And you're also going to have a significant amount of British standards that are out there to actually support that process. And in addition to that, the Institute of Structural Engineers provides a huge amount of specialist technical guidance as well. Now, for ongoing in-use buildings, where I want to focus, we've obviously got BS 8210 2020, which is all about facilities management maintenance. And that provides us with some very interesting and very good guidance on how we can actually manage the risks in respect of the structure and the fabric of that building during its in-use phase. And then going on from that, just focusing on one British standard, but there are plenty of other guidance out there in respect of demolition. We've got BS 6187, the Code of Practice for Full and Partial Demolition, which will support risk management processes through the demolition process. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to focus a little bit for the next couple of minutes on BS 8210, because structural risk management is actually fully enshrined within that Code of Practice, and it's a really good Code of Practice that supports the whole process. And it's made a very clear statement very early on in that particular standard, which suggests that failure to maintain the structure and fabric can, of course, affect its function and presents safety risks, in addition to reducing the value of the facility as an asset. So clearly, structural risk management is a key element here in order to actually maintain the building, and as part of a facilities management team's processes as well. Next slide, please. So what does the actual standard suggest that you should be doing? First things first, you need to actually understand the building. So you need to maintain records relating to the structure of that building. So the first thing we ought to try and get hold of, and I clearly understand that getting hold of some of this information is incredibly difficult, but trying to get hold of plans and design arrangements is incredibly important. Understanding the design parameters of a building is vital. It used to be that many buildings, especially in London, used to have signs within them to actually indicate the design loadings. that facility and that requirement clearly has gone, but actually understanding those design loadings is a really important element, especially if you're going through refurbishment or change of use of building, moving from one building, say a commercial office block that's being converted to a residential block. There will be differences in respect of the loadings, and they need to be actually fully understood. In addition to that, you need to really understand the structural detailing. Now, I'm not suggesting that you need to actually understand the full structure of the building and how it operates. You need, though, to understand the key connections, where those connections between, say, columns and beams are, and how they need to be treated, how reinforcement needs to be protected. And of course, if you've got post or pre-stressed materials within that particular structural frame, then you need to know exactly where they are so you know how to treat them if you're going through the maintenance processes. Next slide, please. One of the things that actually is very, very interesting within the standard is that actually they make it very clear that you need to be assessing and inspecting the structure of the building on a regular basis. In fact, it states that a full assessment and inspection at intervals of not more than 3 years for the structure and fabric, etc., should be undertaken by competent persons. I have to say, in my experience, that we often suggest this to clients, but we're just not seeing organizations actually undertaking this type of really important inspection and assessment. It's really important, especially for buildings that are going to be covered by the Building Safety Act. Next slide, please. So talking of the Building Safety Act, I just really wanted to touch on the term of what building safety actually is and how it's defined within the Act. But Section 84 of the Act makes it very clear that in respect of high-risk buildings, residential blocks over 18 meters or 7 stories that are occupied, that the accountable person, or the person who generally owns the building or has the lease for and controlling interest of the common parts, must make all reasonable steps to firstly prevent building safety risks from materializing. And a building safety risk has been defined within the Act as being the risk of fire spread and structural safety. So structures, as Sophie was saying there, is often seen as the poor cousin to fire safety. But in addition to preventing those risks materializing, it's really important that we look at actually understanding the fact that despite all of the activities that are undertaken to prevent, there may be times when those risks and those structural risks materialize themselves. So the idea is to actually reduce the severity of any incident that does actually materialize itself. So next slide, please. In order to meet the requirements of the BSA in respect of structural risk management, we are still waiting for guidance and secondary legislation from the government. So what we've looked at and how we've been advising clients is really looking at the likes of BS 8644 Part 1, on the understanding that that's actually going to be reviewed, as well as looking at the RIBA Plan of Work guidance, as well as the Institute of Structural Engineers Plan of Work guidance. So we would suggest that in respect of the structure of this building or any building, you should be looking to actually ensure that your risk assessments at least cover structural issues, that you look for those condition surveys that are actually contained or recommended within BS 8210, that any other surveys, records, drawings, or specifications that you've been able to obtain should be held. And then, of course, all maintenance records in relation to the structure need to be available. If possible, but it may not be necessary, it does really depend upon the age of your building and the type of building. It would be good to have details of the building control approvals for that building. And if possible, although I totally understand it's very unlikely that you'll be able to capture this, some original design data in respect of the approach, what type of design and the Kenny calculations that are available. And we would suggest these need to be stored not only as part of your golden thread, but be there to support your safety case as well. I think one thing that I want to mention, though, is the term proportionality, because proportionality is really important here. You do not need to know everything about the structure of every single building. It could be that, for example, buildings pre-1970, which was when the Ronan Point results for the building regulations came out, that they would not have been designed in respect of disproportionate collapse. And so therefore, you may want to actually have additional evidence about those buildings rather than the buildings that since the 1970s that have actually been designed with disproportionate collapse in mind. Next slide, please. So what does the safety case report probably require you? Because I say we're still waiting for guidance, although the guidance from the regulator at the moment is suggesting that we really do need to understand how the building was designed and constructed structurally. So we need to actually understand the foundations. We need to understand the structural frame. We need to understand if disproportionate or progressive collapse considerations have been taken into account. We also need to understand about the exterior wall and the roof. We ought to be thinking about what could go wrong. So what failure scenarios need to be considered and what control measures do we have? We also need to understand the current condition of that report and what are our future plans for that particular building. The guidance from the regulator says that we should be looking at management for now and in the future. So it's really important that we understand those future plans as well. Next slide, please. So I've not given all of the failure scenarios that certainly we are aware of. Just thought I'd give you some overview and understanding of the type of failure scenarios that perhaps needs to be considered, such as the structural failure of a primary load-bearing element. So that could be down to, say, overloading or installation error, construction error, or actually incorrect design. That could lead to disproportionate collapse or falling debris, and obviously that may lead to potential severe injuries or even deaths as well. We could have also, for example, external impact. I've dealt with personally a significant number of buildings where, for example, cars or lorries have driven into buildings because of the lack of protection. So collision with buildings need to be considered. And again, what control measures do we have in place to prevent that if it's actually necessary or seen as a major risk? And then, of course, issues such as major fire could in fact actually damage the protected elements of structure to such an extent where we actually have collapse of part or all of the building as well. So you need to understand all of the potential failure scenarios when you're actually looking at your safety case report, because the regulator is going to be looking for how are you preventing that or limiting the consequences of any action. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned section 84 of the Act earlier. What the Act also goes on to also mention within section 84 is the fact that there is a very, very clear need that when you're considering the steps taken in respect of building safety, that the accountable person actually makes and give effects for the purposes of ensuring the effective planning, organisation, control and monitoring and review of those steps taken, a management system, a building safety management system. Now, a lot of organizations have corporate management systems. Those management systems are very clearly a framework, but we need to therefore focus very much on the specific building itself. And the HSC have come up with a very simple plan, do, check, act approach that could be used in order to support that whole process. Next slide, please. What we would suggest needs to be included within your local building safety management system is certainly a statement of intent, a policy statement. That's not an occupational health and safety policy statement out of the Health and Safety at Work Act or even out of ISO 45001, but something that's very specific about building safety. details of the organisation, who is doing what, clear roles and responsibilities, very clear statements in respect of what management activities, what assessments are actually undertaken, the maintenance and remediation action on both a proactive and reactive basis are actually going to be in place or required for that building. The government have looked at a digital management system. So how are we managing using digital systems? And I can show you one very quick one in my next slide, as well as look at how are we now reporting what we call mandatory occurrences. And Sophie mentioned the fact that we are still waiting for legislation. One of that pieces of legislation is actually going to fully define what a mandatory occurrence is, but we can see straight away that mandatory occurrences will include structural failures of whatever size. Now, these are not the same as RIDDOR. RIDDOR obviously is about human beings. This is about the building itself. And then the final element of your building safety management system should be all about how you actually learn from the issues that you found, management reporting, how you audit and how you review. Next slide, please. My final slide is just all about digital platforms. It's about making sure that whatever digital platform that you use in order to support the building safety process, that you actually have access to all of the available information. So you need to make sure that whatever your system, and our system's called CUDA, it's been designed to support building safety. This is the building safety case section. And in this instance, for example, we're able to actually store condition surveys and other information relating to the structural safety of that particular building, and actually maintain a document history and an audit trail of what's been done to that building as and when it gets changed. That's the focus of the end of my presentation. So Sophie, back over to you.
Thank you, David. There's always a little bit of a delay. So please, can I encourage the audience to ask your questions? We already got an excellent question in from Anna that I will be weaving into some of the other questions. David, just to start off with you, even though we've just had quite a bit of space, you mentioned only 4 out of 25 different causes of structural failure. Can you give us a little bit more of an idea what the wider causes of structural failure actually are, please? Yeah,
some very interesting ones that we've seen. For example, during refurbishment, a lot of people don't understand the actual structure of the building. It's been inadequately assessed. And I mentioned earlier, for example, the use of pre-stressed or pre-tensile materials within a structural frame. And those particular materials are not particularly well suited to being adjusted. Drilling into them is not a particularly good or advisable event. So refurbishment issues are very much in the fold, especially, as I said, as we're seeing significant changes of use from office buildings to other building types, mainly because of the pandemic, but also because of other requirements to increase the housing stock that we've got within the UK, and obviously encourage people back into the city and the town. Maintenance issues. Again, retrofitting of services is one that constantly causes us concern. We often find absolutely superb management systems in place, fantastic records about compartmentation and about structural arrangements, only to find that 3 or 4 months down the line, a retrofitting exercise of fitting in BT, or, and that's probably unfair on BT, but telephone or satellite services, constantly we find those issues are actually being or are damaging the actual structural integrity. We find, for example, instead of just drilling a hole, people are actually taking blocks out. And in fact, in one instance, we found 3 blocks completely removed from a load-bearing wall in order to put in 3 10mm cables. So a lack of understanding, maintenance and refurbishment. You've then, of course, got issues such as water ingress, damage to reinforcement, all of those types of things. And of course, we've got climate change coming up where our buildings are not designed or haven't been designed for the types of weather that we've got. So weather patterns are changing. The codes in respect of, for example, wind loadings need to be reviewed because we've got certain elements such as those as need to be considered. Hopefully that's given you a bit more of a flavour of those risks.
Absolutely, absolutely. Wayne, I would like to bring you in because we had an excellent question on the RAAC issue and furthermore potential issues with wood wool and Stramet. Now, reinforced concrete is something that's hugely challenging in especially the education sector. I've come quite a bit across it. Do you want to share your thoughts on that particular issue?
Yeah, and I think a lot of this comes down to understanding if you've had it, where it is, how it's been affected or how it's likely to be affected, and what kind of monitoring and measures need to be put in place to manage it. It's a bit like managing asbestos. You ultimately, if you've got it, you need to know what it is, what type it is, where it is, what age it is, what condition it's in, and then what you should or can and can't do in and around it. So it certainly needs to be within your information and maintenance management system that we have this is where it is. Anybody who goes anywhere near this can do these things and can't do these other things without further approval. And it's making sure that you know that. Now, a lot of times, and this comes down to competence, it's people's understanding of what it actually is, or when they see it, what it is. So a lot of the time, it's like with all of, it's to say again, if you treat it as if it was asbestos and put in place a mechanism to say, if you come across this, go find out what you need to do about it. Don't just think that you can just carry on doing what you're doing, and make sure that it's a managed process and a managed activity is put in place where you have it or where you're likely to come across it. And it's not as straightforward as that, because certain things you can do to it in certain types and certain things you can do in other types. You can't do it on both, but in all instances. But it does require a competent person and a competent procedure put in place to manage it. Whether it's we'll call it all deleterious materials, all materials that are affected by any change, and it comes down to this: your pre-stressed panels, they will be affected by change. You need to understand that, because if you allow business as usual type activities to happen on these substances and these materials, it could cause a serious or have a serious detriment to the building. So it comes down to that change management procedure and making sure that you have done an assessment, whether you have it or not. It is properly tested. It's the same as carbonation and chloride testing. You need to understand if you have it and what you need to do about managing it when you have it. And it does require sometimes breaking through, sometimes sort of a bit more technical investigation than you might otherwise want to do. So then you need to say, okay, we think we've got it, and then treat it as if, right, we think it's there. We will then have to manage it as if it was, like an asbestos situation. If you are going to work in that area, get the investigations done at the time you do the works, or you're looking to do the works or designing the works.
Okay, thank you. That's very comprehensive. Do we have something to add on wood wool and Stramet quickly on that one?
Yeah, it's the same. It's the same thing. So they all have their own specific technical issues, depending on location and what they're being used for. And again, it's a management procedure. If you know you've got it, there's enough guidance out of there for you to be able to implement a process or put in place a process that if you do come across it, or you do have to work in those areas, that you follow those processes. There's lots of government guidance, there's lots of specialist engineering guidance about understanding what it is and what it looks like and where it's likely to be, I think is probably one of these. But ultimately, you should already know that, because when these things became an issue, it's a bit like when Roaring Point happened, there was a whole pile of legislation put in place that you were supposed to have done a disproportionate collapse assessment. Now, when stock transfer happened, everybody did disproportionate collapse assessments and everything that was stock transferred. Everything. I did hundreds of them. So that information is there somewhere. So you should know you've got it. And with every single new thing that's found to be an issue, there's generally guidance comes out and says, you must have done this, or you must go do this assessment. They then tend to have been lost in microfiche, or they're there somewhere. But if you know you've got it, you just have to have a management procedure in place to deal with it. But it must be, you must have it written down somewhere, and it must be in your procedures for any work you do in those areas that something additional must be done.
Thank you, Wayne. David, I saw you nodding. Did you have any further?
No, totally agree. And it just reinforces the fact that actually safety management system, take out the fact that the law in respect of residential blocks over 18 meters now requires it. That management system, I think, is so important when you're actually looking after any type of building, because actually understanding your building and understanding where these different materials are, deleterious materials, and again, I couldn't agree more with Wayne. Treat them as if they are asbestos. Understand where they are and understand what you can and cannot do with them is really, really important.
However, that is all good and well if you've had the building for a little while. But if you have just taken over some buildings, how can you approach that situation? Two areas, really. How can you look out for structural risk just in the building on site, but also, and I'll make sure to come back to this if we forget about it, Anna asked the question, how can I approach that situation if I cannot locate the O&M manual for the building I've just taken over? Thoughts, please.
I'll take a stab first. Look, let's be honest. In England and Wales, Regulation 38 hasn't worked, has it? Which is why we've got changes being put in place. Regulation 38 clearly requires key information to be handed over to the person who's responsible for that particular building. It may have happened, but of course buildings move on, buildings change. How can you get that information? Incredibly difficult to actually go back and seek that information. You could try, depending upon the age of the building, and speak to your local building control authority and see if you can actually get some original design data, if they are willing to provide that for you. You normally will have to pay a small fee, and it does depend upon whether it's local authority building control or whether it's an approved inspector. Some approved inspectors see the information as being copyrighted and therefore will not release it, whereas local authority builder control, as long as you are the owner of the building, they tend to issue that information, but not all of them will do. Getting hold of that type of information, if you can't go down that route, then I go back to 8210, actually undertaking a full assessment of your building. A survey undertaken by a competent person, a chartered surveyor or a structural engineer, or could be both, to actually determine exactly how the building has been built, the materials that have been used. That is going to take some level of intrusivity. And you may want to also include perhaps a type 4 risk assessment or fire risk assessment at the same time, because that again is going to look at the intrusive elements in respect of fire safety. So you can actually try and deal with two things at once. So certainly, we would certainly strongly suggest that if you can't get information based on that, you've got to actually undertake and bite the bullet and actually have a good, thorough survey of your building in order to actually determine exactly what you've got, where it is, and what condition it's in.
I'll add to that, Sophie, because there are certain things which are a legal requirement that you must know ultimately. So if you have lifts in the building, you need to have the records. So if you've just taken over a building, you have absolutely nothing. There are you need to go through what is the minimum level of information I require for all for the operation of this building, and it will all depend on the complexity of the building. But ultimately, you don't have an option of not knowing certain things, and you have an option of things being where you don't need to know so much. So you're looking at it on that proportionality basis. If it's a high, you would risk assess the building and understand what are the higher risk items that I need to know, what's my legal responsibility to know these things, and get them done. And then you can set in place a strategy. So ultimately, I would look at it and say, well, what do I need to know now? Get that done now, and then I'll build up something to get all the other information I need over a certain period of time on that proportionality basis. But yeah, you know, to say my background's mostly in large scale refurbishment, and you look at it and think, when these buildings have been managed by this organization for 20 years, they should have this information somewhere. And most of the time, you spend months getting the information that they should already have. They've got a legal obligation to keep it, and they just can't find it, or it's not easily available. It's not in a format that's accessible, and ultimately they end up just doing it again. You just say, well, like, we haven't got time for this, we'll just go do it. But then I'm doing refurbishment, so it's in the budget. I think if you're doing the day-to-day operations, they tend to get left. People do bury their head in the sand a little bit when it's something that's not readily accessible and it's not been asked for all the time. But a lot of buildings, especially buildings that are over, say, 15 years old, you get less and less information the older they get, and more information is required to be collected before you can justifiably, as a competent person, allow any major works to happen. And I think it is just building up, making sure that somebody spends some time in a library, and most organizations will have an information library, mostly on microfiche, that you really need to spend some time down there searching through everything. Nothing's ever collated, nothing's ever in the right place. I went into one library once, and the drawings were just a pile of drawings, thousands and thousands and thousands of drawings. I eventually find out, well, not me, but I asked somebody to do it for me, find out what we needed, but they probably spent 2 weeks in the library and pulled out 100 drawings out of maybe 5,000 drawings that were not collated in any way. You were just flicking through saying, what's the address on that one? What's the address on that one? And it's just finding out, making sure you understand what you have, and then an assessment based on risk of what you don't have, and then go get it.
Thank you, Wayne. Just to keep on the information point and the data point, and David, you mentioned intellectual property and kind of getting access to potentially on building data. We had an excellent question from Nirmal, apologies. How could FMs keep ongoing data where the outsourced help desk managing agents has changed a number of times during the life cycle of portfolio, and data was in a different CAFM digital system? That's not hard to imagine that happens, right?
Oh, it happens all the time. We're seeing it constantly. How can FMs keep ongoing data? I suppose I'm going to answer it in two ways. First things first, we've got the Building Safety Act, and I know I'm jumping back to that again, but the Building Safety Act and the idea of the golden thread and the legal requirement now to transfer information between accountable person to the next accountable person is now going to prevent that situation from occurring, or at least it should prevent that from occurring. We are in a regulated space there. The regulator is going to want to see a declaration from accountable persons or clients, who whatever the information is coming from, to say that such information has been passed through, and it's going to be held digitally. So in respect of that particular field, we've actually now got a regulated approach that actually, I think, if it is regulated and if it is adhered to, we should see a vast improvement in respect of the transfer of all information relating to that building, whether it's using a BIM system, whether it's using another system. It doesn't really matter as long as it's transferred. I think it's much harder where we've actually got that non-regulated area, because how can people get hold of it? It's about being tenacious. It's about being resourceful. It's about doing exactly what Wayne has just said. It's about burying yourself in the systems that are available. If they are held by others, it's by badgering them. It's by saying to them that you have a legal requirement to transfer information. You had a legal requirement, as Wayne said, to actually store information relating to lifts, relating to other elements as well. So that information is available somewhere. It's about making sure that you are tenacious about it. One final thing, never ever underestimate the fact that in storerooms across buildings in the UK, we have found locked filing cabinets full of O&M manuals that nobody knew anything about. So it's worthwhile actually looking about what's in the building itself, what information is actually held within the building itself, be it in plant rooms, storerooms, anything like that. You'd be surprised what you will find. It's about, though, being tenacious. It's about being, it's about nagging people and really getting into their skin and saying, you had a duty for this. We need that information. And they may not give it, but at least you've tried.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can I add to that one, Sophie? Because I've come across this quite a few times where the holder of the FM database, ultimately using an external third party, when you decide not to use them anymore, saying that they don't want to give you, or there's an issue with transferring it to somebody else, or whatever. But ultimately, if you're paying for that service, the information is yours. And I think you just need to be forthright about it, saying, well, actually, that's our data. We will have it, and we will have it within this period of time to transfer it to the new one. They should not, under any circumstances, and you can hold up the Building Safety Act as being your requirement that they do it going forward, but they should not be not giving you that information, because the information is yours. The fact that you're not using them anymore is secondary. It's not their proprietary information. Whether they might give you in a format that's not as acceptable as you would like, but ultimately, as a very minimum, you'll get it on a spreadsheet. Because it is yours, not theirs. It might be their software that deals with it. So yeah, I've come across that quite a lot. I just say, well, it's ours, give us it. We'll have it by this date. If not, there'll be legal action following.
Do you think that it might actually require some guidance and further explanation from the HSE on that particular area? Because, I mean, Oliver picked up on this as well, Olivier.
Yeah.
Can you please confirm there is an obligation under the Building Safety Act to transfer info from one agent to the next on the golden thread? And I think the difficulty is that ultimately the managing agent isn't the accountable person, and the duty is on the accountable person. So
the golden thread has a requirement for open source, which means anybody should be able to access it in a format, or it should be in a format anybody can access. So ultimately, unless it's a very old, long-standing contract that you have with your managing agent, the information is the client's, and they have an obligation to give you it. But the golden thread has an obligation that information should be in a format that is readable by our open source format, usually PDF, for instance. And I think, it's not been tested legally yet. But it will be, no doubt, at some point. But ultimately, contractual obligations, the information is yours, not theirs. And getting it out of them is a difficult bit, but they have an obligation to give you it.
I guess what we're going to see is also a need for clarifications around contracts to deal with this issue, as you've just said. David, I do want to come back to you because the Building Safety Act 2022 has not yet released its secondary legislation around the golden thread, and we're expecting some clarifications around what digital actually means. Olivier asked another question, whether the Act is actually asking us to use an electronic management system, and that ties in with what Wayne has said around open source. Can I have your thoughts on this particular question?
Yeah, I mean, you're quite right, Sophie. The Act itself is a framework act, and we're waiting upon secondary legislation. The draft secondary legislation that I've seen doesn't necessarily mean it's going to come out that way. It does talk about the requirement for the client or to maintain a digital system. So there will be a legal requirement, we understand, if it all goes ahead as planned for that. And as Wayne said, there'll be a need for open source data to be able to make sure that it can be transferred. I think the way that we've been thinking and the way we've been trying to get our clients thinking is think about 50 years down the line. This building needs to be thought of in that way. So we need to be able to make sure that that information can be transferred to whoever is responsible over that particular period. So yes, there is going to be a legal requirement. Is it in force at the moment? No. And we're still waiting for the secondary legislation. And as you mentioned to us earlier, Sophie, we were due to have that legislation this week, but we're still waiting.
I would not expect to see it before September, in all honesty.
I think you're right. It's after parliamentary recess. I think that's what we're going to see.
which obviously with obligations coming into play from October 2023,
Yes.
is going to be difficult, but we will be trying to manage that by providing that information and guidance around that within the Institute. And obviously, I think you both have made a number of pertinent comments around the whole digital piece. We'll see how it will play out in the actual act, but ultimately, the regulator will need to be able to access your documentation. So if you haven't got systems in place around that, you don't have that information available in a structured manner, then you're going to have difficulties demonstrating that you have done your due diligence towards the regulator. And David,
sorry, can I just mention one thing? Because it's a really, really important point that you raised there. The regulator needs to have access. Not many people are aware of the fact that when you register a building, you pay £251. And a lot of people seem to think, well, that's the end of the fees. Unfortunately, it's not. The regulator has been set a very simple target. They must have 100% cost recovery. And so when you are required to submit your information to the regulator, you will therefore be charged on an hourly basis. And the regulator has made it very clear that that hourly basis has got to be in the region of around about £163 an hour. So imagine someone's looking at your particular building. They may be spending 30, 40, 50 hours on your building if it's very well structured, easy to understand. But if they have to then start thinking about 70, 80 hours, you could be talking about significant increases in not only the time, but the fees as well. So it's a really good point that you made there. The regulator needs to have access, but actually, if you do not provide that access and you do not provide it in a good, well-structured form, it's going to cost you a lot of money as well. When I say you, the accountable person.
Yeah. I was just going to make the point of best practice. We are within the Institute obviously wanting to support our members across the piece, not just on the residential piece, but ultimately having good information management systems in place will obviously help you to make better decisions down the end, and you want to invest in that particular piece. I had another interesting question here. Well, I've actually got loads of interesting questions, I would say, unloading them. But I'm going to have to start being picky here. In terms of legal compliance, you mentioned the need for regular inspections of structure. Is there a legal compliance standard for these inspections?
Again, there's no legal requirements yet. We will soon find out that within any secondary legislation for buildings contained within the Building Safety Act. There are other legal requirements in order to undertake regular inspections of plant, equipment, and other systems within the building. Again, I just refer everybody back to BS 8210. I think it's an absolutely superb standard. And if organisations can actually undertake regular inspections every 3 years by a competent person, someone like a chartered surveyor or even a structural engineer, to actually ensure that that building, its structure remains stable, that there is no damage, and if there is damage, is it going to cause any particular issue in the long run, then that's going to be really, really important. So at the moment, no, there's no legal requirement, but certainly we are expecting the legal requirement. And in addition to that, there is a legal requirement to provide your safety case report. And your safety case report needs to include data and information relating to the structural stability of that building. So there again, I mean, I don't think I can say much more than that at the moment.
Yeah, I'll add to that one, Sophie, because the way that all of the legislation is structured is that they're making you, the accountable person, responsible for deciding what the risk is. And that is the bit that's causing most confusion in the market, because you could decide, well, actually there's no risk as the accountable person and ultimately do nothing, but you need to make sure you've written it all down of why you're doing nothing. So whilst it's not a requirement to do it, if you have a lot of old buildings, for instance, and then you look at them and you risk assess your portfolio and saying, what are the chances of something happening? You use that as being your so I suppose started saying there is a risk that there's something potentially going to happen to that building, we will put in place a process that allows us to understand what that risk is, and then what we're going to do to mitigate that risk. And it comes down to one of these other questions. I think it was Liz has put one in about the competence of that person doing the survey. Then ultimately, a competent person knows what they don't know. So you know you could do an annual walk around inspection just with your maintenance staff, for instance, and they can flag up instances that you then go through what more competence do we need to make sure that that risk is being mitigated. So if you're walking around a multi-story block and after a severe series of storms over the winter period, you notice that there's some cracking in the stairwells. That should trigger an action that a competent person investigates that and makes sure they understands what the effect is. If your portfolio purely consists of all new build stock where you've got all the information that you could ever need, do you require to get it done every 3 years? Probably on a risk assessed basis, no. But you might say, well, actually, we'll do it every 5 years or after an event. And you work on that basis. And I think it just comes down to, and I think this is the bit that does cause most confusion is, well, okay, when it comes down to funding, when it comes down to just the capability of the market to deliver what we need, you risk assess it on that basis. What do we need? What is the biggest risk? We'll put in place a program, we'll put in place a strategy that allows us to deal with all of the risks as we go along, as opposed to trying to say, I need to know everything now. And that nobody is going to, well, actually, I'm going to say nobody is not going to pick you up on that if something goes wrong. But ultimately, you need to have a strategy in place to how you're going to deal with your risk on all of these buildings. And it's up to you and the accountable person. No doubt, if you're the estates manager, you'll be the one asked to make the assessment, to pass it to the accountable person. But it's just understanding that risk and then putting in place a program to mitigate those risks going forward. But you're going to have to do something. You're not going to get away with doing nothing. And whilst the Building Safety Act is for buildings over 18 metres, that will gradually reduce. So whilst it's your high rise, it will go to mid rise to low rise, and you'll have to have the same process in place for everything.
Right, Wayne and David, I've got 2 questions I want to ask, and I'll ask them each of you to take one only, and I'll ask a short answer, please. We've had a few more questions come in. One, practical examples around loading capacities. One of the loading capacity relates to multi-level car park loading capacity and the increase of electric vehicles, which is also, of course, part of the climate change response. We know that those electrical vehicles are significantly heavier than standard combustion engine vehicles and were probably the basis of the original loading design. Thank you, Mark, for your question. Who fancies taking that one briefly?
I fancy taking that one. I'm doing a lot of EV charger installations at the moment, and this has actually come up. Yes, so when a lot, especially older ones, older multi-story car parks, you're not going to have the information, and there's going to need to be an assessment done, and that assessment will have to review the rules of thumb that would have been in place for over-engineering the structure at that time based on the loadings that would be applied. And the thing is, vehicles have got heavier, just generally anyway, but there's a significant increase in we'll call it a per square footprint of loadings than there was before. So you will need to do an assessment of these structures over time. You would hope that anything new is getting that factored in. And it's been done, but I won't be surprised if there are additional structural supports required or additional improvements required to multi-story, multi-level car parks over time as more and more electric vehicles come into force. And it would be the same, I would expect, to say you have a height barrier and decide that actually we don't need a height barrier on the top, to get and provide additional access to a top story of a car park, and you allow vans up there, which are substantially more heavier. There needs to be a structural assessment done to say, what can you do? And it may be that you have to restrict the numbers of vehicles going into floors as one way of mitigating. But there is definitely an increased load, and it's definitely a structural assessment that needs to be done, especially the older ones as you go along.
Thank you for that. David, I want to touch back on competence. I think that's a good place to finish off with the question. And we've had actually a number of questions around competence. Olivier asked, what type of surveyor should we asked to carry out a building survey. I think that the point is much more widely, you know, where can we find out about the competence of these people? Who should be on your team? And who can you genuinely rely on to sign off information? But feel free to unpack that as you want, because there's a lot in that question.
There is a lot in that question. Wayne mentioned it earlier, a competent person, the most important element is that they know what they don't know. And it's really important that you actually, when you're actually engaging somebody to actually undertake a survey for you, you want to understand what they've done in the past and really get to grips with how they go about the process, and understand that. Competence is actually very difficult to actually test. We do have a new PAS 8673 in respect of building safety management, so it's a good one to actually have a look at. But again, that doesn't really focus much on structural safety at all. So I would suggest you need to start looking at who you currently use, what experience do they have in respect of that building, what knowledge do they have, what skills do they have, and importantly, what behaviours do they show as well. Not just the qualifications. Qualifications is very, very good, but knowledge, experience, skills and behaviours are just as important to actually look at that. One thing additional to competence as well is making sure that they are insured to do what you're asking them to do. So hopefully that's unpacked that as quick as I can.
No, that is brilliant. And we, of course, also know that the HSE will be looking at competence, and further competence standards will be developed over the course of the forthcoming years, to be honest, because they will be looking at the more encompassing element of, as you said, David, skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, and we still have a few outstanding questions, but I think we'll have to pick it up at another time. I just want to thank both you, David, and Wayne, and our listeners for the great interaction. A recording will be available for anyone who wants to listen again with a friend, and you can also find the CPD number, which has just come up on the slides, 8537418. We will be doing a few more webinars on building safety over the coming at least 6 months, with all the different changes that are going, and ARC Workplace Risk will be a significant partner in that. Thank you as well to our webinar support team, Lauren and Kaya. We will be having a short summer break here, and we will be looking forward to see you again for our first post-summer webinar on the 6th of September. Thank you so much for your attendance today. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.